Hello everyone! In this lesson we will get back to writing CSS. To be more specific, we will clean up the styling for this large hero block down at the mobile small screen view. And also, for all screen sizes, we will begin working on this intro section. If we look at our design file, we see that that section is supposed to look like this. Alright, so let's get started. The first thing that I want to work on is cleaning up the mobile styles for this section. So the first problem that I notice, aside from these font sizes needing a bit of attention, is the fact that this text is pushed up against the very far left and right edges of the device. And from a design perspective, that is something that you want to avoid at all costs. So let's work on adding a bit of spacing or padding on the left and right sides. So let's jump into our text editor and make that happen. Now, our first instinct might be to open up the large hero CSS file, since that is the block that we are looking at. However, we need to ask ourselves, is wanting content to not push up against the very edges of the screen unique to this block? Or is that a pattern that we could use again and again throughout the page? Well, I think we can answer that by moving our eyes down the page about 100 pixels to this section. We don't want this content to push up against the far edges either. So clearly this is a design pattern that we are dealing with. So because this isn't unique to the large hero block, instead of writing CSS in this large hero file, let's go ahead and create a new module. Let's name this new file _wrapper.css. Let's create a class named wrapper. And let's give it a bit of padding on the left, let's say 18 pixels, and let's also give it a bit of padding on the right. So we can save this file, and be sure to go into our main styles.css file and include an import that points towards the new wrapper file. So go into the modules folder and grab _wrapper. Go ahead and save this file, and now we can use this new wrapper class in our HTML. So let's open up our index.html file. Let's scroll down a bit to find the large hero section. Here it is. So where do we want to add that new wrapper class to add left and right padding? Well, we know that we want the picture itself to be full width. So we don't want to apply any padding to this main parent element. We only want to apply the padding to the text content. So down here, this div that houses all of the text content, let's go ahead and wrap these elements. So starting with the H1 and ending with the paragraph, let's wrap these within a new div, an extra div. So right before the H1, you can create a new div and give it a class of wrapper. And then right after this paragraph, add the closing div tag. And then let's be sure to select from the paragraph to the H1 and indent, just to stay organized. So go ahead and save this. And if we check the browser, we now have the spacing that we wanted. Next, let's fine-tune the font sizes for these elements. So to do that, let's open up the largehero.css file, and I'm going to resize my text editor so we can see the browser in the background. So let's begin by fine-tuning the font size for this Your Clarity element. Here is the CSS rule for that element. So right now it has a baseline font size of 1.1 rem. And that is clearly too small. I think we can afford to have a larger font size, even at the mobile view. So let's try 2 rem. Let's increase that just a little bit. Let's try 2.4. Looks good to me. And we can obviously afford to use a larger font size for larger screens. Now, in an earlier lesson, we set up 3 media queries for this element because we were really trying to drive home the point of how to use a mixin. But in reality, I think this is overkill. I think as soon as the screen gets to this at small size, we can begin to use the full 4.8 size. So let's change this to 4.8 rem, and let's just delete this at medium and this at large mixin. Alright, next, I think we can afford to bump up the font size of this one trip away element. So here is the rule for that element. Let's change the font size from 1.1 to 1.5. Looks good. Next, let's shrink this font size quite a bit. Let's scroll down in our CSS file. Here is the rule for that element. Now we want to leave this font size in place for desktop large screens, but we do want to set a smaller baseline font size. So let's copy this line. And down here, let's use a mixin at small. So once a browser window is large enough to at least be considered small, instead of microscopic or tiny, which is our baseline, then we can use a font size of 1.8. But let's lower the baseline to something like 1.1. That looks a lot better. Next, let's lower the font size of this button for small screens. So the CSS for this button element lives in the modules folder in the button CSS file. And if we look in our HTML to find that button, so I can search for get started today, here is that element, and we see that it is using a BEM modifier class of button -- large. So back in the button file, we want to edit this rule. So I think this font size is okay for larger screens. So let's create a mixin and say at small, go ahead and use that font size. But for smaller screens or for our baseline, I don't think we even need to define a font size at all. So that will just default to 1 rem. I think that looks a bit better. All right, so at this point, I think the large hero block looks excellent on a smartphone. And all of our styles that target larger screens are still in place. Let's check the design file to see if we forgot anything for this block. I think the only thing we're missing is this blue bar that runs along the bottom. So let's add that in really quickly. In our largehero.css file, let's scroll to the very top. And within this main large hero rule, let's add a new line. And we can create this bar by using the border property. So let's say border bottom. How thick should the border be? Let's see. That looks like about 10 pixels to me. So let's say border bottom, 10 pixels, solid. And what color do we want it to be? We can just use our main blue variable. Let me open the browser in the background and then save this CSS file. And we see that the blue bar was added, but there's this tiny white gap in between the image and the blue bar. And we don't want that gap. The reason this gap exists is because our image element is an inline level element instead of a block level element. I will explain what that means in just a moment, but first let's switch the image to be a block level element so we can get rid of the gap. So in our CSS, for the large hero block, we don't currently have a rule that targets the image file. So in our HTML, let's scroll up a bit. Here is the picture element, and we want to add a class on this image element that it contains so that we can select it with our CSS. So let's give it a class of large hero because that is the block that it belongs to. And using the BEM system to signify that this is an element, we use 2 underscores, and let's name this element image. All right, now back in our CSS file, we can select the image by creating a new rule. And let's just tell it to be a block level element. So as soon as I save this file, the gap will disappear. And there you have it. Now, if you're wondering how this works, here's a quick explanation. By default, web browsers treat image elements as inline level elements. What does that mean? What is an inline level element? Well, it basically means that the browser thinks the image is similar to a line of text, right? So if we change this to inline, the gap comes back. And that's because when the browser thinks that this might be a line of text, it wants to leave a little bit of room for the bottom part of certain letters that hang below the rule. So if you think of a G or a Y, you get the idea. So by declaring that the image should be a block level element, we are telling the web browser that it should treat the image almost as a div, right? So it treats it as a rectangle that can align perfectly without worrying about leaving any room for bottom parts of letters. All right, let's change gears. So at this point, our large hero block is complete. Now let's move on and begin styling this intro area. If we check out the design once again, we see that that section should look like this. So the question becomes, where do we begin? How do we begin to transform this into this? Well, let's just work our way down from the top to the bottom. So the first piece of the design that I see is this empty space, this white space here. So if we look in the browser, that space doesn't exist. Now, to create the vertical spacing that we want, our first instinct might be to add bottom margin to the large hero block, or to add top margin to this heading. But before we do either of those things, I think we need to stop and ask ourselves a question. Is wanting vertical spacing between sections of the page unique to this area of content? Or is that a design pattern that we could reuse throughout the entire page? Well, if we look at the design file, we already noticed the spacing here, and if we scroll down a bit, the next big section of the page is this Our Features area, and it also features a fair amount of top padding or vertical spacing. And if we scroll down further, the next big section of the page is this Testimonials area, and it also includes a fair bit of top padding or spacing. So I think it's fair to say that this is a design pattern. So to create spacing between the large hero block and this content, let's create a new block. So in our text editor, within the modules folder, let's create a new file. Let's name this file underscore page-section.css. So let's create a class named page section. And if we look at our design file, this new class will have the responsibility of adding top padding and bottom padding for each section on the page. So we can just say padding. Let's try 4.5 rem space 0. So this is CSS shorthand. This value will be used for the top and bottom padding values. And we don't want any horizontal padding, so we add a 0 for the left and right values. So let's save this, and let's be sure to open up our main styles.css file and import in this new page section module. So modules folder underscore page section. So let's save this, and now we can use the new page section class in our HTML. So let's scroll down in our HTML. We see that there is already a div that is wrapped around all of the content that begins here and ends here right before the Our Features section begins. So this is the perfect div to add our page section class to. So let's save this and check out the browser, and there is our vertical spacing. All right, the next thing that I think we should address is the fact that this content is pushed up against the very far left edge of the screen. Now earlier in the lesson, we already created a block named wrapper that can help us out here. So in our HTML, within the div that we just added a class of page section to, let's create another inner div with a class of wrapper. Let's indent all of this content. And after it, be sure to include a closing div tag. So if we save this, in the browser, we see that the content is no longer flush against the left edge. Now, while I think that's enough on a smartphone or a small screen, I think we need to take things one step further for large screens. So for example, if we look at the design file, we see that throughout the design, there seems to be a max width of about 1200 pixels. So back in the browser, we don't want the content to be as wide as the screen, because if I had a 30-inch monitor and my browser window was full screen, it would result in text lines that are way too long for the human eye to comfortably read. So let's do this. Within our CSS, in the wrapper.css file, let's add a max width of 1200 pixels. So we see that that creates a maximum width, but we want it to be horizontally centered in the screen. So let's also say margin left auto, margin right auto. There we have it. Now I know we are supposed to be focusing on this section of content, but really quickly I want to show you an example of why it's worth our energy and effort to think of our design in terms of reusable blocks and repeatable design patterns. So for example, let's look at the design file, and let's scroll down a bit and change gears and look at the Our Features section. Watch how far we can get styling this section by simply reusing existing blocks. Let's find this content in our HTML. So if I search for our features, we see that there is already a div with an ID of features. Let's give this div a class of page section. So in the browser, we see that that creates the vertical padding above and below the Our Features section. Next, let's give the section a blue background. Let's go ahead and give this section a modifier class named page section -- blue. And then in our page section.css file, let's create a new rule that targets that blue modifier class. And we can just say background color, main blue variable. And let's make the text white. So now in the browser, we now have a full width blue background section, just like the design file. And we can use the wrapper class to limit the content to this middle 1200 pixels instead of using the full screen. So in our HTML, within this div, let's create another inner div, give it a class of wrapper. Let's indent all of this content and close out that div that we began. And in the browser, we have now centered the content. All right, so hopefully that gives you an idea of just how useful it can be to identify patterns and create reusable blocks. Now let's shift our focus back up to the content that we were working on earlier. This will actually bring this particular lesson to a close, but in our next lesson, we will pick up right where we left off. Let's keep rolling along, and I will see you in the next lesson.